Sure. Yeah. Next.
All right, so we're going to move to our next agenda item, which is the Legislative Review Committee recommendations. And our former president, Kyle Schiketti, is going to present.
Thank you. It's a little weird for me to be sitting at this end of the table, having sat where you all sat for the last 5 years. This is a different perspective for me. I'm proud to be back. I'm also excited to see that we also have former Governor Higginson also with us online virtually. And it shows that some folks, sometimes people have a hard time leaving this organization and find their ways back in various ways. And I happen to do that in this particular case, and I'm happy to be here and in front of all of you. I was asked to attend today on behalf of the chair of the Legislative Review Committee, Brian Considine. As many of you know, Legislative Review Committee is a brief background. It's been around for at least a couple of dozen years that I know of. It's always served a very important process for the organization to vet proposed legislation that would become before the WSBA and the WSBA Board of Governors Legislative Committee. It's a mix of different folks from around the state, a mix of different practices, perspectives, and backgrounds that ensure that whatever legislation sections or various entities bring to the WSBA for sponsorship or support is adequately vexed and run by various organizations and people who might have input, either positive or negative, before it comes to this body. That's been a very important thing, as I've seen on the Board of Governors, because sometimes, occasionally, such legislation comes before us and it hasn't been properly vexed. And as Governor Stevens knows, that's one of the priorities for us, to make sure that we're getting the full perspective and input from the people who would be affected by potential legislation. So today we have one bill that came to us from the CARC committee, and the CARC is Corporate Act Revision Committee. For the last several years, as long as I can remember, both as the chair of the Legislative Review Committee a few years ago, and then chair of the Legislative Committee for the Board of Governors, they've brought pieces of legislation that have to do with the Model Act and sometimes changes to the Model Act to help improve Washington's corporate governance and corporate statutes. They've worked closely with Senator Peterson over the years, and each time they've got a plan for bringing new legislation each year, and then eventually more towards the Model Act. It's a complicated statute. I believe, Legislative Affairs Manager Sanjay Walvikar on the line, who will go over what the proposal is. The CARC committee is asking for sponsorship and to move forward to be able to testify on behalf of the legislation at this next legislative session in Olympia. But before I turn it over to Legislative Affairs Manager Walvikar, there's a comment from my perspective. The Legislative Review Committee does important work to look at this legislation to make sure that it has been thought and considered by organizations, sections. It's not the policy making organization or committee. You all are the policy organization. And I know through the ethos meetings that we've had for the last few months, there's been discussion regarding legislation and whether we should be involved in it at all. That's not really the province of the Legislative Review Committee. They've been chartered to come with you with a proposal, and that the debate on whether we should be involved in litigation at all, that's up to you. But I would hope that we would avoid the urge to ask the Legislative Review Committee to wade into those waters, because they haven't had the legal advice or the counseling that all of you have had as part of the Ethos project and elsewhere. So I would take this as a recommendation from that Legislative Review Committee on the particular legislation, and then do with it what you will. There's been a lot of discussion about the Paul aspect of how to properly administer and advocate for litigation. They've been briefed on it, but they're not taking a part in any of that. That's not their responsibility. So I just wanted to make sure that people understood that was not their charge. Their charge is look at the legislation, make sure that different groups have seen it, find out the pros and the cons of it, and then make a recommendation to all of you. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Legislative Affairs Manager, Sanjay Walvakar.
Thank you, Past President Schiketti, past LRC Chair Schiketti. So unfortunately, our real subject matter experts were unable to join us. They're both traveling today. So I'll give sort of a 30,000-foot view of the proposal. As past President Schiketti alluded to, this bill is part of the annual changes to Washington's Business Corporation Act, brought to the board every November by the Corporate Act Revision Committee of the Business Law Section. And that committee's acronym is CARC. CARC's goal is to keep our State Corporations Act updated, especially when it comes to Delaware and the Model Business Corporations Act. And their primary goal in that effort is to keep Washington State a desirable location for businesses to incorporate. And to that effect, they've proposed incremental changes to the Corporations Act for at least the last dozen years. And each of those bills have passed the legislature and been signed into law by the governor. This year, we have one bill, one proposal from CARC. That bill amends the Corporations Act to add a provision enabling Washington corporations to effect holding company reorganization transactions without obtaining shareholder approval or triggering dissenters' rights. That bill amends Chapter 6 of the Corporations Act to clarify the mechanics for effecting forward and reverse stock splits and make corrective changes in other sections. And the bill amends Chapter 11 of the Corporations Act to clarify when shareholder approval of a plan of merger or share exchange is not required. And because I'm not exactly a subject matter expert, I will ask you to look at some more detailed information from CARC about these changes that's available in your materials. You'll also see in your materials that the Code Revisor's Office has prepared a draft version of the bill. We already have a sponsor lined up in the legislature. As past President Schiketti referenced, Senator Jamie Peterson is the Corporations Act expert in Olympia, and he's agreed to once again sponsor CARC's bill. He's also the former chair of the Senate Law and Justice Committee and the current majority floor leader in the Senate, so he's well positioned to champion this bill if it's introduced. And I'll also just add that having the bar sponsor this legislation is actually really helpful in the legislative process. Knowing that this bill is coming from CARC and the business law section, and that it has been vetted by the bar process by way of the Legislative Review Committee, helps to avoid unnecessary amendments. It helps the bill to gain co-sponsors across party lines, and generally just really helps move this bill along based on the reputation of the subject matter experts and the requesting agency. As you can see in your materials, we've shared this proposal with several key stakeholders, haven't heard any concerns. We anticipate that this will be well received this session, as these bills usually are. And I know that the Legislative Review Committee and CARC would appreciate your sponsorship, and I'm happy to answer any questions if I can. Thanks.
So I'm back to ask the question again, because we have requests to support and requests to sponsor. So I'd like to know what the differences are.
Governor Stevens, I'll jump in here. When we sponsor a piece of legislation, the bill itself indicates that this is a request of an agency. So the bill itself will say in the bill title, by a request of the Washington State Bar Association. That signals to legislators that it's agency request legislation, and to a certain segment of legislators who know about the Bar Association's role in the legislative process, that will let them know that this has gone through the review process by way of the Legislative Review Committee, which is to say that it meets the requirements of GR 12.2 and that it's been properly vetted both internally within the bar and by external stakeholders such as the Department of Financial Institutions, et cetera. I think to support a bill in the legislature is something that the board sometimes does. But because this is originating within a section of the bar, we have traditionally sponsored the legislation, and it's helpful for some of the reasons I mentioned a few minutes ago.
Okay,
I move to approve.
okay.
Second.
Motion and seconded. Any debate? Hearing none, let's vote.
Governor Ottawale,
Aye.
Governor Angelville, Governor Boyd. Aye. Governor Couch. Governor Dresden,
Aye.
Governor Fay,
Aye.
Governor Kading,
No.
Governor Wynn,
Aye.
Governor Petrasic,
Aye.
Governor Pertzer,
Aye.
Governor Rathbone. Aye. Governor Sayani,
Aye.
Governor Stevens,
Aye.
Governor Williams-Ruth. Motion carries.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kyle.
Yeah, and thanks to you also, the Board of Governors. And again, every year we come back and we have these proposals, and they're sometimes complex. And usually we have presenters that give us a good background. But year after year, we can trust the people who bring us this legislation and the people on the Legislative Review Committee to make sure that it is vexed. And so appreciate your consideration, and thank you for supporting our work.
Do we also have priorities to approve? Legislative priorities?
Well, I was not prepared for that. Perhaps our manager, Walvikar, knows something about that.
I do. And yes, we do have our 2023 legislative priorities that I think are part of this agenda item. They should be in your materials. I don't know that I have much to add that's not already in the memo from myself and Governor Boyd, who is our chair of the BOG Legislative Committee. I'll just add that these priorities are longstanding. They've been approved by the board for the last several years, and they're drawn from GR 12. When it comes to purpose and why we set priorities, it's really helpful to have a bullet point list of things that the bar cares about that we can share with legislators and legislative staff and other stakeholders during the legislative session, so that we can stay in the loop when it comes to our focus areas. And I'm seeing that those materials are on page 83 of the BOG book. So appreciate your consideration of the priorities and ask for your adoption. Thanks.
Page 84.
Okay, so with this, do I hear some motion?
I'm happy to move that the board approve this.
Okay, there's one made, seconded by somebody?
Second.
Okay, one made, one seconded. Any debate?
I have a question for Sanjay. This, is there any difference between these priorities this year from last year, from previous year?
Governor Adewale, there is not.
Thank you.
Hearing, I mean, none, then let's, yeah.
Governor Adewale,
Aye.
Governor Angelville, Governor Boyd,
Aye.
Governor Couch, Governor Dresden,
Aye.
Governor Fay,
Aye.
Governor Kading,
Aye.
Governor Wynne,
Aye.
Governor Petrasic,
Aye.
Governor Pertzer,
Aye.
Governor Rathbone,
Aye.
Governor Sayani,
Aye.
Governor Stevens,
Aye.
Governor Williams Ruth. Motion carries.
Great, thank you.